executive remuneration practices and levels will remain an area of focus, both for shareholders and their advisors, as well as a source of potential angst for some directors, particularly directors of companies that have already received a no vote under the two-strike rule. Today, I'm going to look at what is and what has been the impact of the two-strike rule, what shareholder associations and advisors are saying around executive remuneration practices for listed companies, and what has been the effect of the recent tax changes for listed companies making awards. I'm also going to make some comments around how those tax changes have affected awards made by private companies and also around the startup concessions in particular. For a listed company, at each AGM, it has to submit its remuneration report to a non-binding vote. So about 4 years ago, we had the two strikes rule introduced. If a company receives a no vote against its remuneration report at 2 consecutive AGMs, then the company has to put to vote another resolution to potentially spill the board. Now obviously this is a major issue for companies who have already received a first strike or where there's been a substantial number of no votes for their REM report. Now no vote is often made as a result of general shareholder dissatisfaction, perhaps rather than a strong view one way or the other on the appropriateness of a company's remuneration practices. We are yet to see what the general trend on no votes will be in this 2015 AGM season, but for the previous 2 years, the number of companies receiving a no vote has remained fairly constant. None of the 3 companies who received a first strike in 2013 received a second strike in 2014. In the 2014 season, 3 companies in the top 100 received a no vote and a first strike. Neither of the 2 companies that have remained listed have received a second strike this year. Despite this, the risk of a no vote looms large for listed companies, and as a result, there have been a number of changes to the way in which those companies engage with their shareholders and proxy advisors. These changes have included improving the level and readability of remuneration reports. Now, from my perspective, this is key. If your report is easily digested and understood, and it tells a story about how your remuneration practices make sense for your company, then the chances of a no vote must decrease dramatically. There's been a general restraint exercised in relation to pay increases and more closely scrutinisation of at-risk components of pay. Lastly, there's been adjustment around performance targets and vesting conditions for at-risk pay so that they're more aligned with market practice. On 16 October 2015, the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors put out a press release and updated guidelines covering executive remuneration issues. In a nutshell, they've reaffirmed their support for company boards with remuneration structures aligned to the delivery of company strategy and designed to promote sustainable long-term performance. In particular, the ACSI has signalled its focus on appropriate shareholdings or skin in the game for directors and executives, support for boards taking deferred bonuses in equity and maintaining an ability to claw that back when necessary, and an opposition to overly generous CEO sign-on grants. Those guidelines underpin the voting recommendations they make to 30 Australian member funds who collectively manage over $450 billion worth of assets on behalf of 8 million Australians. In recent years, the remuneration practices for most listed companies have remained fairly stable, with any changes largely being driven by large no-vote numbers and the need for engagement and better disclosure with shareholders, or driven by internal business need. Now, this may well change as a result of some of the recent tax changes that have been announced and which came into effect on 1 July. Importantly, those changes only affect new grants on or after 1 July, so the awards made before that date will remain under the old tax system. In essence, provided that employee share schemes and awards made under those schemes are properly structured, those changes will mean that rather than options being taxed upon receipt by an executive or when they vest and become exercisable, those options will now be taxed when they're actually exercised. This obviously removes some of the risk of options being taxed at a time when an executive has yet to realise, and may in fact not even realise, any value from the award. For startup companies, specific tax concessions have been introduced. The term startup itself is not defined, and the rules are not limited to a particular type of business or industry. But there are some important conditions that have to be met in order to come within those tax concessions. Firstly, the company and all group companies have to be less than 10 years old and cannot be listed. Secondly, the aggregated turnover of the group can't exceed $50 million, and that includes turnover of connected and foreign entities. Third, If the company is issuing shares, those shares can be issued at a discount, but that discount cannot be more than 15% to the market value. If issuing options, the exercise price has to be equal to or greater than the market value. Lastly, the employee receiving the options or shares can't hold more than 10% of the shares in the company, and that includes any shares that they might get on exercise of an option. So often startups seek to supplement cash remuneration by offering executives an employee share scheme interest as a way to retain and attract talent. The problem with these discounts and concession levels is that it's going to severely restrict the way in which equity can be used for startup companies. The good news is that where the concessions apply, then the employee will not be subject to income tax, they'll be subject to capital gains tax. That'll happen on sale or transfer of the share, where they hold the share itself for more than 12 months, or the option and the resulting shares for more than 12 months, then they're subject to a 50% CGT relief. And what that means is the tax rate is effectively halved. Now that's a great tax result.